I want to welcome everyone to SWAC's March lecture. Our president and faithful leader is unable to be here tonight because he's traveling in California and Arizona for a post-COVID trip to see family. So you're in my hands tonight. Fortunately, he's going to be able to see this on video because we're recording it, and so he'll be able to see it later. And so check your website from time to time because hopefully we will have the recordings on our website in the near future. So I want to take this opportunity also to thank the new college for providing the auditorium space that we use, as well as supporting SWAC's mission. We have developed an important relationship with the college as we provide community education on international issues. And they've been very supportive of us, and I feel that we're doing also a good job in bringing the new college some international interest. I know that it's a bit bizarre, a bit of a bizarre disconnect given how I'm dressed, but I do want to wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day. In honor of this day, although we won't be serving green beer, we encourage our members to attend the monthly appetizer and wine reception that follows our lecture. The reception that follows every lecture is a great opportunity to spend some one-on-one time with our speakers and to socialize with the others who share an interest in international issues. For $100 a year per member, or $125 a couple, you will attend 7 lectures and have 7 receptions. We often say, and I believe it's true, that we're the best bargain in town. So, if you are here for the first time, or if you have attended our lectures in the past and have been thinking about joining SWAC, or if by any chance you just wandered in here by mistake on your way to lost on your way to a St. Patrick's Day party, you'll be welcome to attend tonight's reception. Just inform one of our members of our staff that you would like to know us better, and you're welcome to come to the reception, which is 2 minutes away. Just follow the crowd as we leave to drive over there. So last month, on February 15th, we were fortunate to have Dr. Angela Stent and Ambassador William Taylor in what turned out to be the imminent invasion of Ukraine just a few days later. We will continue to present updated briefings on that situation from some of our country's top experts during SWAC's 2022-2023 lecture series that begins in October. In the meantime, media coverage of the Russian invasion and the heroic defense of the Ukrainian people has been nonstop. I began thinking, though, lately, however, about the fact that it has been less than a year since the extensive media coverage when the U.S. Armed Forces left Afghanistan, with the media coverage of people trying to get on the planes and hanging from the bottom of cargo planes and tragically losing their lives. But now news reports on the post-conflict repercussions for Afghanistan have dwindled, are in fact nearly non-existent. So tonight I have 2 prominent experts to provide a briefing for us on the current political and humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. Scott Worden, Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia for the United States Institute of Peace, has worked on Afghanistan for over 10 years. He directed the Lessons Learned program for the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. He was acting director of policy as well as a senior policy advisor for the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs at USAID, advising on strategies for sustainable development. The list of his accomplishments is long and impressive. Scott will provide us with the latest up-to-date information on U.S. policy in Afghanistan. But that's not all. Tonight, we are presenting a double feature. Chris Nadeau, who received the National Award for Citizen Diplomacy, is the founder and American director of an Afghan school project that she has founded and sustained for over 20 years, with the participation of 6th grade students that she teaches in Michigan. The actual name of the project, the school, and its location will not be identified tonight in order to protect the children there, and her beautiful website has been temporarily taken down. Hers is an amazing story, and it's a special honor for me to introduce Chris because I have known her since the very inception of the school project. Chris and I met in the late 1990s, a few years after she had returned from Afghanistan following the takeover of the Taliban in 1974, and after I had returned around the same time after working in Bosnia during the conflict there. Interestingly enough, her decision to found the school came during the World Affairs Conference of America annual conference in 1999 that we both attended together in Washington, D.C. Tonight is a very special event indeed, and I'll turn the program over right now, this time, to Scott Worden and Chris Nadeau. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thanks everybody here. I was particularly quick in accepting this invitation to speak because my parents happen to spend the winter down here and they're in the audience. This might be the first time, maybe since a high school play, that I've presented to them. So thanks for the great introduction. As discussed, I come at this from a few different perspectives. I spent time on the ground in Afghanistan. I lived there in 2005, 6, and 9. I've worked for the U.S. government in a policymaking role, and now I'm at USIP, where we work both with the former Afghan government, but also civil society organizations and activists on the ground. So I've seen it from Washington, and I've seen it from Afghanistan in different roles, and I'm bringing that perspective to my remarks tonight. Let me just say a word about the U.S. Institute of Peace. We are an interesting and unique institution. We were created by the U.S. Congress in 1984 as a nonpartisan institute to address conflict prevention, conflict mitigation, and conflict resolution in foreign abroad. So we don't do any work in the U.S. We're not government employees, but we only receive our money from the U.S. government, either from the Congress and the State Department, USAID. So we're closely aligned but independent, and that gives us, I think, also a unique perspective. And we operate both in Washington in our headquarters, as well as having field offices in countries around the world where there are U.S. interests and where there's either conflict or post-conflict. So that included Afghanistan until August 15th. We had an office there from 2008 until just last year. We were fortunately able to evacuate our staff during the harrowing period when the airport was closed, and as you mentioned, the cargo planes were leaving. But we remain in touch. We call it a suspension, not a closure, because we hope to get back. And are in constant touch with the Afghan civil society leaders, activists that are still on the ground and struggling to preserve the gains over the last 20 years in rights and development. So my talk tonight, I want to focus on 3 different areas. First is, what is the situation on the ground now? It's not good. Second is, how do we get here? We had 20 years of investment, well-advertised $1 trillion worth of assistance in funding our military, as well as donations to the Afghans, with totally different objectives than the Taliban winning in the end. And then what are the ways forward? I will foreshadow that I don't have, and I don't think there are, really great solutions, but there is a continuing need to engage in Afghanistan. So let me tackle those topics in turn. First of all, the situation on the ground is dire. Afghanistan is the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now. Okay, I have to edit that. Ukraine is, but until 2 weeks ago it was, and it still remains quite concerning. Afghanistan has about 40 million people. It's the same population roughly as Ukraine. 23 million of them are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, which basically means they are short of food, they are short of water, they are short of critical health care. It's an emergency need. The UN just issued a call, and there's a conference on March 31st, a donor conference, for $4.4 billion in immediate humanitarian assistance for this year. And that's the largest appeal that they've ever issued. I guess we'll watch the space for Ukraine. In addition to that, they've asked for $3 billion of development assistance, which is less urgent but still badly needed. So the situation there almost couldn't be worse. The GDP of the country has declined 40% in the last year. We have an economist, a former head of the World Bank, on our team in Washington. I am not an economist, full disclosure. Says that is impressive. That's the most rapid drop in GDP anywhere. It said it took 5 years of the Syria conflict to drop their GDP by an equivalent amount. So the economy has completely collapsed. If current trends continue, more civilians, Afghan civilians, could die in the next year from the humanitarian crisis than over the last 20 years of conflict with the Taliban. So the need is great. Let me talk about some of the different dimensions of that and multiple areas of the crisis. The humanitarian crisis is fundamentally an economic crisis. I mean, the only good news in this situation is that the result of the Taliban victory is that there's no more combat, there's no more IEDs. They won, there's not an armed insurgency from the former Afghan Republic against them yet. I think it will come, but maybe over time. Nonetheless, the combat situation is much better. It's the economy that has led to a lack of money, which has led to a lack of food, which has led to starvation and urgent medical crisis. So first, you have the loss of donor aid. Last year, so before the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan got about $8 billion from foreign donors. About half of that was civilian, about half of that was military assistance. The military assistance largely paid salaries. Afghanistan had about 300,000 combined police and military. And in addition to the war equipment, they were all paid by foreign funds. So that $8 billion is gone. So far, pending this appeal of donors that I mentioned, they've only gotten about $2 billion in humanitarian assistance. And that's really in the form of bags of weed or cash for work on a daily basis. So $8 billion gone, replaced with $2 billion that is not really equivalent. It's obviously a bad equation for livelihoods in Afghanistan. The other problem is that the regular economy, apart from the aid, has also evaporated. And this is the result of both international sanctions, because the Taliban were listed as a terrorist organization by the US, Europe, others. So you can't give normal transactions with the Afghan government until recently. And second of all, there has been discussed in the media, the foreign reserves of the central bank were all held in the United States and Europe. That's $9 billion, and that's been frozen, largely because the Taliban are a listed organization and have listed UN-sanctioned terrorists at the head of their government. So they can't, therefore, operate a normal banking system. Correspondent banks have pulled out of Afghanistan, and there's just no way to get cash into the country without flying it in pallets. And very few people want to do that. So even people that have financial resources, which is an elite upper middle class, upper class group, they can't even access it from their bank account. It's a $200 withdrawal limit if you can even find an ATM that has cash. So that economy is ground to a halt. The purchasing power and the ability to import food and so many other goods has gone away. Now, there's some good news, I will say, on this front. The United States Treasury, which is kind of leads the world in deciding about sanctions, they have just issued new licenses which, in theory, allow for normal banking functions to resume. But private banks are very risk averse, and so far, they haven't gone back in. So Afghans can't even access the money that they have on their own books. Let me move on from the economy. There's also, I would say, a human rights crisis. So obviously, one of the worst parts about the Taliban was their extreme abuse of women when they were in control in the 90s. We haven't gone back to quite those days yet, but it's still a very concerning situation. Essentially, the Taliban have, under extreme pressure, agreed to allow girls to go to school. The test case for that is coming up at the end of the month. Schools are usually off for the winter in Afghanistan. So at the end of March, schools should resume, and that will be a test case of whether they actually make good on their promises to allow girls in school. So that's one fundamental right. But more than that, women are basically excluded from public social functions in Afghanistan. Some women are allowed to go to work that are working for humanitarian organizations or the foreign organizations delivering relief. But many women are either too afraid or prohibited from showing up to public sector jobs, and the burqa has come back as mandatory, and women feel intimidation and fear, understandably, for wanting to be out in public and assuming their old roles under the Republic. More than that, journalists are under threat. There's disappearances and extrajudicial killings of particularly military and intelligence officials of the old regime, but also people that worked with international organizations. are being searched, having their property seized, and in some cases thrown in jail. So that's something that is of urgent concern and attention to the West. I also want to talk about what I would say is a political crisis. This is not as acute, I think, right now, given the rights and the humanitarian concerns. But the Taliban, because they were able to win by force, didn't have to compromise with anyone, any other ethnic or political groups, in order to assume power. And they basically took the most radical and militant of their members and gave them the top positions in government. So the Taliban movement, for those that haven't followed, is overwhelmingly Pashtun. The Pashtun ethnic group in Afghanistan, usually considered a little less than half, 5% of the population. There are 4 main ethnic groups, which also includes Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks. And these other ethnic groups basically have no representation in government at the top levels or even at the mid-level. And if you look back to the conflict in Afghanistan over the last 50 years, while there's a lot of drivers, and I can talk about that in more detail, political, economic, regional, fundamentally it's ethnic divisions that have been the fault lines of the conflict. And so the fact that the Taliban have come in, exclusively favored Pashtuns in all of their positions of power, exclusively favored religious conservatives and mullahs in otherwise technocratic roles, means that, one, they won't be able to govern well, but 2, there's going to be simmering resentment. And I think while we have an initial period of shock, where the other ethnic groups, the former republic, they're disorganized, they're really stunned at the Taliban victory, it's only a matter of time, if they don't have a more inclusive way of governing, that there will be a new insurgency, this time other ethnic groups against the Taliban. So that's something to deal with over the medium term, but it can't be ignored because you're sowing the seeds of conflict again if you don't address political inclusion, in addition to these other points. You know, I would just say the Ukraine conflict, as I mentioned, has understandably grabbed the headlines. That situation is terrible, and now it's generating even more refugees than Afghanistan. But, you know, we have to do both at the same time, because otherwise you're building up a liability in Afghanistan, and you'll have to deal with the Ukraine crisis and an Afghan crisis that's worse. So, how did we get to this point? That's a long story. We're doing a lessons learned project. Maybe I'll come back and tell you in a year. But for anybody that reads The Sun Also Rises, to paraphrase Hemingway, he said this about going bankrupt. But my answer to how do we lose this war is 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. So the broad arc of the conflict, I could say, is we invested too little in the early years. It was very easy, disarmingly easy to get rid of the Taliban. They were unpopular, they fled to Pakistan, and it seemed like the job was done, and we also focused on Iraq. So all of the math, and you all both worked in the Balkans, if you apply the equations for the Balkans and what needed for a smaller population and a smaller terrain for reconstruction, we gave about a 1/10 of that amount to Afghanistan per capita. So we underinvested early. There were other problems, but the Taliban were able to regroup, and Pakistan supported them. By the time we were aware that, oh my gosh, the Taliban actually have some staying power, they were given sanctuary in Pakistan, even though Pakistan was nominally our ally, we realized that a bit too late, and then we flooded resources in. So when Obama came to power, we had the surge, both military and civilian surge. We flooded it with money that fueled corruption. It empowered warlords who really weren't popular themselves, although they fought the Taliban. And I think of it kind of like, if you're teaching somebody to ride a bike, they need momentum, but if you push too hard, you're going to have them fall over. And I think that's essentially what we did by supercharging our aid to the state of Afghanistan. They couldn't absorb that, and that created its own problems. I think then, when we finally came around late in the day to the surprising strength of the Taliban and the fact that there was no military solution available for the conflict, we weren't going to defeat them, even with the Afghans on the battlefield. When we started to negotiate, it was a bit too late. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but fundamentally the Taliban had proven themselves to be able to resist a military surge, when we had 150,000 combined US and NATO troops. So when we were down to 15,000, they really thought that they could outlast us, and it turned out they were right. Let me say, as well, I alluded to some of these points. If we're assigning blame, I think it's owned by many different actors. But I already mentioned, I think Pakistan behaved from a U.S. policy standpoint irresponsibly. They said that they were helping us, but fundamentally Pakistan enabled the Taliban to take over, and they have complex reasons for that. They keep focusing on the threat from India and wanting what they call strategic depth in Afghanistan. So they wanted a weak or compliant Afghanistan in case they got attacked by India. I can go more into that, but fundamentally they were the ones that gave the resources, the space, the safe haven for the Taliban to be as effective an insurgent force as they turned out to be. The U.S., I mentioned some of what I think are our faults in terms of the levels of assistance and attention we gave over time. But fundamentally, we had, I think, dual strategies. They were in competition with each other, and they never really got reconciled by a succession of presidents, both Republican and Democrat, where part of our objective was narrowly focused on counterterrorism. It was going after al-Qaeda. It was going after the Taliban as a vehicle to support al-Qaeda. And we pursued a military short-term game where we favored warlords because they could fight the Taliban, not thinking about what they did to Afghan governance. The other theory of the case was more along the lines of, dare I say it, nation building. And it was to increase the economy and the democracy of Afghanistan so that there wouldn't be fertile ground for terrorist groups. And these two were often at cross purposes, and we wound up doing neither one of them very well. The Afghan government, however, I think doesn't escape responsibility. On the one hand, they were weak, they needed support, internationals didn't help them in several ways. But in the last several years, when it comes down to it, I think the government made a fundamental miscalculation that the U.S. would never leave, that we needed to be in Afghanistan more than we did. And so, really, it was a political compromise, a difficult political compromise amongst the Taliban and the different Afghan factions that was needed to have an enduring peace. And the government thought that they didn't have to compromise because we would always have their back. And then when that turned out not to be true, we saw a very rapid collapse. So they missed opportunities that they should have taken to compromise for the long-term survival of the state. And the Taliban, I think that they've set such a brutal tone. They kind of set low expectations that maybe get a bit of a pass. They've been brutal and consistent throughout. And that persistence is what, I'm not praising it, but that persistence is ultimately what led to their victory. Let me say the turning point of this really occurred in 2019 when President Trump appointed a special envoy who had been a previous ambassador to Afghanistan, who's of Afghan descent, Zalmay Khalilzad. He appointed him special envoy and gave him an important mandate to finally focus on a peace settlement. And then two things happened. One, Khalilzad made a decision with Trump's support to negotiate directly with the Taliban without the Afghan government in the room. This has been our principle all along. One of the reasons why talks between the Taliban and the government never got started. The Taliban always wanted to talk to us, to the foreign enemy, to the one with the real military power, and not to their fellow Afghans. Well, we agreed to that formula to try to jumpstart talks. And that was a turning point. The second thing is that we actually put our troop presence on the table, on the negotiating table with the Taliban, and said, we will fully withdraw if you do certain things. Now, that enabled the agreement that happened in 2020, February 19th, between the U.S. and Taliban to lay out some conditions, both for our withdrawal, but also, ostensibly, for direct talks between the Taliban and the government. It had certain conditions, and the famous phrase was that nothing's agreed till all is agreed. And these conditions were interrelated. So we would agree to withdraw our troops on a timeline if the Taliban would agree to negotiate about a political settlement with the Afghan government. The problem was that we weren't serious about the conditionality. It became fairly clear over time that while Taliban weren't meeting their interim conditions, President Trump was withdrawing troops regardless. And then, when President Biden took over, in April, he announced that he would agree essentially to the same timeline, even without conditions being met. So both Trump and Biden essentially said this is a withdrawal agreement and we need to get out and we can't wait for progress at the negotiating table. I think that really marked a tipping point where you had the Afghan military losing morale, you had a lot of the Afghan politicians losing morale, and then we saw what surprised me, what surprised I think every expert and even official in the government, was an incredibly rapid advance by the Taliban because there was this loss of confidence in the future across the board on the Afghans' part. So that leads me to the most difficult point. Where do we go from here? First, let me make a case for why it matters. Why should we still struggle to try to solve the problem in Afghanistan, or at least assist the Afghans to have a better life, to have more stability? I think it is in U.S. national interest and foreign policy interest. I would say first and foremost, I think there is a moral obligation. I would say this, I've lived in Afghanistan, you'll hear much more in the next presentation about the worthiness of that. But, we made promises about democracy, we made promises about development, and Afghans took real risks to try to fulfill the aspirations that we had mutually, jointly, about a democratic, pluralistic society. To abandon that at this point, even with the Taliban takeover, I think personally is a dereliction of responsibility. But I would say, since realpolitik often carries the day in foreign policy, I think most fundamentally there's a security benefit to the U.S. of trying to maintain engagement with Afghanistan, continuing to give aid, looking for a political solution that is more inclusive, that I mentioned was key to preventing future conflict. An ungoverned state is a recipe for terrorist safe havens. I think that's been proven around the world. And a non-inclusive authoritarian government in Afghanistan, as I said, I think loads the spring for a future conflict that would then either have a collapse of the state or fiefdoms where terrorists could play one side off of the other and gain ground to attack either the U.S., hopefully not, but also regional neighbors, so Pakistan, Central Asia, and that can bring in powers into a regional war that would affect the U.S. The biggest risk is between Pakistan and India, two nuclear-armed nations. So Pakistan's quite fragile as it is. They've got terrorists now attacking. There's the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, that are using the new safe havens created by the Afghan Taliban to attack Islamabad and other targets in Pakistan. So that's just one example of where the terrorism threat through Taliban rule can rapidly domino into India and a conflict that would encompass 1.5 billion people. So the terrorism safe haven threat is there. I think there's an immigration issue or refugee migration issue. So Afghanistan, again, until Ukraine, had the largest source of migrants, both long-term and short-term. That's destabilizing for the region, and to the extent that they continue to try to go to Europe, it's destabilizing for Europe that's dealing with the Ukraine resurgence. And we saw how disruptive that was to European politics and transatlantic relations when it happened in the Syria case. And furthermore, if you don't get better governance in Afghanistan, more inclusive governance, this humanitarian disaster that is costing $4 billion a year, at least in pledges, that will continue. And so, we won't have a cost savings even though our military is gone if we keep having to pay humanitarian aid just to prevent mass starvation. I think that there are a few things that we can do now. One, I mentioned looking for ways to get the regular economy functioning by easing sanctions without recognizing the Taliban. And so I think this is a delicate balance, and I think I know firsthand from Washington that our bureaucracy doesn't move at the speed of the crisis. But enabling private sector actors and money to get flowing to NGOs, to humanitarian organizations, to ordinary Afghans without paying directly through the Taliban government is a way to try to have it both ways. And I think we're starting down that path. It needs to be consistently followed. So that's to say, don't recognize the Taliban, don't pay them directly, but fundamentally civil society groups are both oriented toward human rights, but also service delivery. It's the whole health system, the rural health system in Afghanistan, is really Afghan NGOs with foreign support outside of the health ministry. And so there are ways to empower the Afghan people without overly empowering the Taliban, and that should continue. I think we should be quite clear that we will not recognize the Taliban and also work with not just our allies, but some of our adversaries in maintaining a united front to say the Taliban can't get recognition until they demonstrate that they can govern responsibly. And that means protecting women's rights. That means allowing a representative government. I don't think elections are coming anytime soon, but this Pashtunization that I mentioned has to be more evenly balanced. It's notable that not even Pakistan has recognized the Taliban yet. And the one thing that the US, Iran, Russia, China, and Pakistan, very strange bedfellows, all agree on is that the Taliban are too extreme to recognize right now. So we need to work not just with allies, but also with adversaries to maintain a united front and keep pressure on the Taliban. And finally, we just need to continue engagement over time and have a bit of patience, which is, I think, one of the problems that we had throughout the 20 years of conflict. On the one hand, oh my gosh, it's exhausting. We've tried this, we've invested so much blood and so much treasure with the failure, we should walk away. Well, this common saying, which I agree with, is that we didn't fight a 20-year war, we fought 21-year wars. And if we can try to reverse that and maybe have a little less pressure because we don't have our military involved on the ground, having more of a 3-year strategy, or dare I say a 5-year strategy, to move the Taliban either out of the way or at least more to the center, that's more likely to produce stability over the long term. So I will stop there. I'll turn it over. I would also say that I was very happy to go first because there are pictures coming. What I said is probably a lot less interesting. So, thank you.
I do have pictures. Thank you, Scott. That was an awesome overview of Afghanistan, much more in-depth and much more knowledgeable than what I could have given. And I appreciate that because what I'm doing in Afghanistan now and have been for the last 20-some years is working in a very small area trying to help kids get a better life and hopefully, when we started the project, as they're educated and as we educate more and more generations of students, they will grow up to understand how to govern their country and not have a Taliban-type government. It's very sad for me to stand up here and say the Taliban's in power again. 20 years ago when they fell, we were rejoicing, and I never thought I would stand in front of an audience and say, the Taliban's back. Never really thought that would happen. I do have to correct something Lynn said. I came back from Afghanistan in 1994, not 74. I was not working in Afghanistan in the 70s. Yeah, I wasn't working in Afghanistan in the 70s. I was in school in the 70s. It's okay. But I came back I worked in Afghanistan, I went over to teach. I was there when the Soviet government was still in power, and they allowed us 6 months of language and culture study, which was fabulous because then I got to learn how to speak the language. I did not learn how to read and write. I still only read and write at a 1st grade level, but most of the women I worked with in Afghanistan were not literate themselves. So the spoken language was the most important thing. When I worked there, I worked at the international school, which eventually closed because the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, had surrounded the capital and they were closing the schools and evacuating foreign women and children. Because at the time I had no children, I was allowed to stay and I worked at an eye hospital. And I was in charge of taking taking doctors and nurses from the city out to the villages. And that was fabulous. I got to see a lot of the country, got to go through across a lot of lines that usually you could not cross to take this medical care out to the villages. At some point in 1994, or actually 93, I came back to DC for 3 months. I worked at the Afghan embassy trying to help broker peace talks between the Civil War factions. We failed, and I went back to Afghanistan, and the men that I worked with at the embassy found out I was on the Taliban hit list, and they knew Taliban were enclosing around Kabul. I was 7 months pregnant with my first daughter, and they thought it was really important that I get out then. So they came over, put a headscarf on me, put sunglasses on me, and threw me in the back of a pickup truck and drove me out through Taliban lines to Pakistan. One of the roughest 3 days of my life, but we made it out safely, and I just threw up a lot out the back of the pickup truck. Sarah was born here, and I have a second daughter, Sadiqa. After I started teaching back in Michigan, my students were able to meet all the speakers that Lynn brought with the World Affairs Council at Wayne State, and we would trade them back and forth. They would speak at my school, and they would speak at Wayne State for Lynn's audience. My students heard a man from Afghanistan speak, one of the men I worked with at the embassy, and they said, wow, we have so much here, and the kids in Afghanistan under the Taliban have so little. What can we do to help? And they decided they didn't want to do a one-time donation or a one-time help. They wanted to do something to fundamentally change the life of the children there. So they decided education was the best way to move forward. We talked to Mr. Worden, he talked to the village elders, and the village elders agreed to donate the land and the manpower if we would raise the money and continue to partner with them until they were on their feet. That was 20-some years ago, and we're still going with them. So I'm going to show you some of the process of that project. I don't know where to point this. There we go. This is the village that we're in. Afghanistan has beautiful, beautiful mountains. I know Scott likes to ski. Someday he can get over there and start a ski resort. This is the village we're in, surrounded by 3-mile-high mountains. The village itself is a mile high. Oops. I don't know how to make it work, I guess. It's actually, you know, I'm not sure if I'm pointing at the right place. The village itself had no education ever before we started there. Do I have the wrong one or did the battery die? Battery died. I found the one that has another one. There was two up here.
Okay.
How about that? You knew I was going to make a mistake. You can see down here in the village a little bit. This is where the project is. They had no education, no health care in this village. In the village, there had been some men that had been educated to 6th grade level, but not one single literate woman in the village. This is Mr. Warden. When we started the project, before the first days of school opened, we were able to work out a grant with Wayne State, with World Affairs Council, and we brought 2 students and 2 teachers over to Michigan for 2 weeks to attend a conference at Wayne State and then visit with the families at the school I worked at. And these are some of the students in the middle that helped start the project. The students and teachers had never been outside of Afghanistan. The little boy had never been out of our village, had never seen electricity, had never had shoes on his feet, and had never seen running water before. So it was quite an experience for them all to come here. This again is the village. We were ending a 7-year drought when we started the project. On the side of the road, you can see this is the school. The students decided if they've never had health care, we also need to give the students their vaccinations and health care in order not to get them sick when they come to school. So on the other side of the road is the clinic that we started building. There's no electricity, no running water, no machinery. So all the men and the boys in the village dug the foundation for the schools, and then they cracked up rocks and they used rocks for the walls. They had to go to different parts of the country to find different minerals to make mortar, and then they covered all of the walls with mud and hay mixture to protect them. This is me when I visited. They built a guest house, so if you all want to go visit, there's a guest house there. I'm doing laundry. One of the things my students always ask is, what did I dress like when I was over there? This is a nice dress, and the one Lynn has on that the village women sewed for us as gifts of thank you, but that is what I would normally wear on a normal day. This is another dress they made for me and one for each of my daughters. The dress I have on in that picture, it took 7 women 12 months to hand sew. They embroidered all of the materials and they sewed it together, and at this point when they made this dress, they hadn't met me in person yet, so they made the size according to a picture they saw with Mr. Wardock and me. This picture is one of the girls' classrooms. What's important about this picture is the girl in the middle with the white scarf. We had 80% malnutrition when we started the project because the Taliban did a scorched earth policy in that area and they lost most of their crops and the forest where they would get wood to cook with. The moms, when they're pregnant, were having a vitamin B deficiency, and the children were born with that really fair hair and the really fair skin. This child has had vitamins and is healthy now, but her facial, like her features and her hair have never gone back to the beautiful, thick, dark Afghan hair. This is another picture of the little boy over on the left. You can see he was born with that same malnutrition. This is his sister right here. They're only a year apart, but you can see the desperate difference between the two of them. These are nomads that live on the back of our school property. They come from Kandahar in the summer. That's their house behind them in the tent. They herd sheep, and what they do when they're here is they milk their sheep and they make a yogurt out of the milk. They make the yogurt in the sun and then they let it dry into balls, and when those balls get hard, they use that as a form of trade to get other things that they need. They're called karut, and the kids love them. They're like a sour yogurt ball. They get really, really hard. And so the kids will suck on them and then they eventually will disintegrate. And moms will take that and they make it into powder and add water and it makes a sour cream type mixture. These are the 2 men that lead the project over there. Maya, the one on your far left, he is the head of curriculum. So when we sit down, we do a lot of curriculum talks on how to train teachers. And what's really nice is because of our relationship, they allow me to sit in on all the trainings and help lead the trainings for the male teachers. Our village elder, who tastes all the food that the villagers bring to me before I eat it, make sure I'm safe, but he's also the head of the school board. This is our first school. You can see a lot of people ask me about mud houses and mud walls. You can see all the homes in the background with the mud walls and the mud homes. Our school, you saw, was rock and then mud, and then they whitewash it with a type of limestone. Because we don't have electricity there, we don't have a lot of books or a library or access to the internet, we've painted as many historical pictures at the project that we can so that the kids can learn from the pictures that we painted. The two men on the end of the school there, one is in white. He is the one that led the Afghan forces against the British, and the other man is the one who started public education in Afghanistan. The other thing you can see is children outside in the classroom. When we were planning our project, we didn't think that we would have that many kids come to school. We thought maybe 150, 200 at the most. Our first day of school, we had 465 show up, and 20 of those were girls, which we were really excited about. The village elders guaranteed that girls could have equal access to education, but at that time the Taliban was still in power, so they were afraid to send their girls to school. The second year, after 9/11 and the Taliban was gone, we had 650 kids in school. We only have 6 classrooms, the boys in the morning and the girls in the afternoon. When I went to Afghanistan right after 9/11, one of the things the village families asked is to build a second school, because if their boys are going in the morning and the girls in the afternoon, the moms couldn't learn how to read and write. And they felt like the only way they could be good moms is if they also learned to read and write. So if we built a second school, the boys would go in one school, the girls in the other school, and the moms could go to school with the boys. And I'll show you a picture of that soon. This is the classroom outside. They take the kids outside in the morning when they first get there, and they do attendance outside, and they check their hands and face are clean because they walk so far. We have students that walk 15 minutes to school and students who walk 4 hours each way to school. The teacher's right in the middle. Here's a girls' classroom, a little bit more colorful than the boys. Another girls' classroom. You can see on the back we have painted the map of Afghanistan. Again, we don't have enough textbooks and enough resources for them to learn, so we try to paint the walls. It's another girls' classroom. This is a boys' classroom. Crowded. Some of our classrooms have up to 100 students in them. This is in the hallway. Before we built the girls' school, we were really overcrowded. We have 50 boy orphans that live at the project. In the first 2 years, they lived in their classroom, so they would go to class in the morning, and then they would take care of the grounds. They would water all the trees and vegetables, and then in the evenings, this is where they lived. They would roll out their beds, and they would sleep in their classroom. So they asked us to raise money for an orphanage, and we built them an orphanage. Again, you can see the historical pictures in the hallways. The outside classroom. We were able to, in the big cities, during all of the years of fighting, a lot of schools turned into military bases, and they weren't using the materials for scholastic purposes. So we went into a lot of old buildings, and we were able to get scraps of blackboards. This is year-end testing. The classrooms are too crowded, so they go outside and they test. In Afghanistan, you have to pass the year-end test to go to the next level. In the background, on the right, you can see the health clinic that we built. And on the left with the minaret is the orphanage. Part of following, when we built the orphanage, part of making sure the kids were safe is we have the minaret that we can use as a call out to the community if there's ever any danger. There's no electricity, but it's hooked up to a generator. So if we need to use that minaret to call out to the community to warn them, or tell them that we've gotten in our truck full of flour, they can come and get their truck full, their big, huge burlap bags of flour. They can come for that. If you can see the orphanage off to the left, the bottom is the like translating in my brain right now. I don't know why. All of a sudden I switched to Farsi. The basement is the kitchen and the shower house that warmed the bottom of the orphanage. This is the principal doing a math lesson. This is the girls' school. So this is the girls' school that we built. You can see the courthouse in the middle, or the courtyard in the middle, so the girls have a garden in the middle, and then they do special celebrations in the middle for the girls. You can also see the wall that we've built all around the schools to keep them safe. We have 1,600 men in the village that are armed, that volunteer on a rotating basis to guard the project to make sure their kids are safe when they come to school. This is the girls' secondary school. The second floor, this is where the 30 girl orphans live. We have not yet built a girls' orphanage. We have been asked by the village to build a girls' orphanage. It took us a long time to gain their trust. During the first Taliban time, girls' orphanages were often used as brothels. So the village families weren't very confident that if we built a girls' orphanage that the girls would be safe there. They now believe that we are a safe group to work with and they want us to build a girls' orphanage. This is recess. So there's their playground equipment, and behind them you can see the gardens that the orphans grow vegetables, and they've planted all those trees. Over the years they have planted 2,500 trees, and then we've terraced different gardens for them to grow. This is outdoor gym class. This is a better picture of the orphanage on the left there, and you can see the basement where the kitchen and the bathhouse are. And then that just warms during the winter, it warms the floor of the orphanage to help them. This is the terraced ground they've done to grow food for themselves. And this is the second floor to the original school. We added a second story onto the boys' school this summer. These are some of our orphans. The one in the top left has a beautiful voice. This is them in the afternoon going to work. They're very proud of their work, and they grow a lot of flowers because they want the beauty also. This is the kitchen underneath the orphanage. They cook everything on wood, burn on wood. They have to go up into the mountains sometimes and get the wood to burn in. But they eat mostly rice and beans or chapati, a very thin, flat, whole wheat bread with tea. This is the other cook. This is the guest house at the top. You saw me behind it before. And halfway up the hill with the white door and the brown walls is the summer kitchen. It's too hot to cook underneath in the basement during the summer, so this is where they cook in the summertime. The guest house overlooks the whole project, and I don't have a picture of it, but now behind the guest house is also a huge water reservoir where we store water, and we have pipes that go down to the schools and the clinic by gravity. This is a picture of the back of the guest house, and you can see the painting that they did on the guest house again. Everything that they can paint, they do with historical pictures. They also put a water tower on the top of the guest house so that I can have running water for showers when I'm there. So you all have running water if you go. This is in the wintertime. This is our first well. Boys in the village at their homes would dig the wells for their homes. They can dig down about 50 feet. Boys about 10 years old are in charge of doing the digging so that they can get down that far. This is our first well. It got about 16 gallons of water a day, which wasn't enough. So we dug a deep well. This well is 135 meters deep, and it's run on a generator. We have an old diesel truck engine that runs the generator to pump the water. This is the first water out of the well. We fill the tank, an old tank that we fill up, and then families come and they fill blue jugs to take home. Most of the kids, not most of them, but about half the kids will bring containers to school. We'll fill them up during school, and they'll take clean water home. We have 500 families in the village that rely on us for all of their clean water. They also use those hoses that you see coming out to water all the trees in the gardens. There's just some more pictures of the wall. We have a volleyball net they put up. This is the clinic, and inside the clinic you can see the pictures that they've drawn again and painted in there. This is a dentist from Colorado that would go to our project. He worked with us for about 7 years. He took the first toothbrushes over. The kids had never brushed their teeth before. And he developed, well, he played chess at night with the kids, developed a drill that he used either off a generator or off a fire extinguisher to get the power off the fire extinguisher to run the drill. He called me after he'd been there the first time. We have a satellite phone at the project. And he said, what are they eating at home? Because their teeth are horrible. And it wasn't from what they were eating, it's what they weren't eating. We had 80% malnutrition in the village at that time. And so their teeth were just being destroyed because of lack of nutrition. This is our doctor, and you can see behind him used eyeglasses. My students have collected used eyeglasses over time. He doesn't match them perfectly, but at least they have something that they can use to try to see and read and write. Mr. Warden, who started the project with us, was killed in an auto accident in 2010, and that was his memorial. He's buried at the project overlooking the project now. And his younger brother took over for him. The family wanted to make sure that they continued this project for the village, and so his younger brother there on his left took over as the Afghan director with me. This is the girls' graduation ceremony. In 2019, we had our first girl graduate from college. She graduated from nursing school. This is a bus stop we built in the village so that when they do get buses from Kabul, which aren't running right now, that they would have a place to catch the bus. And this is our latest project. We're building a hospital behind the guest house over the mountain there, or behind the hill. We have no medical care. People who come to our health clinic would not make it to Kabul. So we decided we needed to build a little bit better facility and try to get doctors and nurses into the village for overnight and have beds and do more serious medical procedures here in the village. This is the outside's done, the walls are done inside, but it hasn't been furnished and we don't have equipment yet. So that's our next endeavor. And you can see all the trees that they planted around it. That's our pharmacy at the current clinic. That's the walls into the area where the school project is. And then these are just some kids learning. This little guy, I have a picture of him now. He was, in 2001, this is him. He is now a pilot. He graduated from our school. He was given a grant to go to Dubai to learn how to be a pilot. And he worked with the Afghan US military as part of a joint force as a helicopter pilot. I have his picture, I have his thank you letter, and all of those things, but we're so afraid of having anybody find him and the consequences that would be connected to an American or an American project. We're very careful. We are in a Pashto village. Our village elders are very supportive. Their main idea is that if girls can learn and become literate moms, they are better moms because their kids are healthier. The village elders from the very beginning have been very supportive of girls and boys going to school. We currently have 1,200 boys and 1,200 girls. We closed about 2 weeks in August during everything happening with the withdrawal of the US military and everybody from Kabul. After about 2 weeks, the village elders decided we were safe in our village and we could open it back up, and we finished our school year in December. We will open our next school year in about a week. March 21st is Afghan New Year, and a couple of days after that we will open up our next school year. So our first school year was in 2001, and so next year will be our 21st school year. Yep. So.
Questions? We have some the mics. Just a minute. Be thinking of questions. Just okay. Without a mic, can you speak loud?
Does it look like they can be safe there, at least in the near term?
In our area?
Yeah.
That's a great question. They can be safe because the village wants them to be safe. We purposely chose this village. It's not on any main roads. And so we're not being passed randomly by anybody. There's one road from Kabul that comes out to our village, and that's it. There's not a road that really goes through other than people that live in the village. Our biggest concern right now is malnutrition and getting them money to support it. We can't send money right now. Like Scott was explaining, because all the financial institutions have closed us down. The only time we've been able to get money from August to now is we had somebody go, Mr. Warden went to the project in November and took money with him. To pay salaries and to buy food for the winter. So that's our biggest concern.
So if you have a question for Scott or Chris, just direct it in the right place. So, yeah.
Question for Scott. In the broad sense, did the Afghan people choose the Taliban, or was it forced on them?
No, that's a good question. It's funny, I was thinking of it. I didn't make that point. You know, I think one of the tragedies or the mysteries of the Taliban takeover is that they're genuinely unpopular. Now, there's regional variation, more conservative, more rural Pashtun areas might actually, largely adopt the values of the Taliban and so forth. But there were surveys done with a caveat that surveys are not always accurate in Afghanistan, as elsewhere. But 5%, usually the approval rating of the Taliban over the last 10, 15 years has been about 5%. Approval rating of the government, with all of its corruption and flaws, is 60% and higher. So you have a deeply unpopular movement that also doesn't bring many economic benefits or others to Afghanistan. And it really defies explanation, except for maybe the Pakistan angle that I was saying, having a safe haven outside the borders, on how they could have such staying power and be able to recruit enough fighters to oppose both the government and the U.S. and NATO. Fundamentally, Afghans are the biggest victims of all of this, not just in the conflict. The civilian casualties have been high, largely because of the Taliban. But they didn't ask for this government. The approval rating for democracy, as bad as elections have been, and I've worked on Afghan elections, they're bad. But people really favored a democratic system and not at all the Taliban's rule. So we'll have to see. People are very disempowered. I don't think that Afghanistan's going to have a color revolution. They don't have the resources or the cultural patterns of resistance like other countries, but the Taliban are not favored by them, and they're victims.
Where is their support?
So we have the mics now, so we have a question.
I'm sorry, where is
Yeah.
their support?
Whoever has a question.
I think again, there are certain rural populations, generally speaking, that probably prefer the Taliban. Certainly the religious argument of the West being infidel and so forth resonates with it. They get their support from Pakistan. They get their support from criminality, and I think it's just an illustration that it is so much easier to win power, with force than to have to be accountable and transparent and govern. I don't know what you must have views on this too, but you can tell I don't have a solid answer because the Taliban are just no majority of Afghans would choose them before or now.
No, and I agree. I know one of the things we have struggled with is some of the men in our village have had children taken through the Taliban and through different things. There's quite a human trafficking that goes on in Afghanistan. They're sold to Saudi Arabia mostly. And there's some other things like that that are with the opium and the drugs. And there's a lot of people that want to keep those things open, and they will fund just unlawfulness in order to keep those things open.
We have one here.
Are they sharing, in the process of sharing with the Pashtun in the government, or is that still alive, or is it over?
Power sharing, you mean?
The power sharing in the government.
Right now, it's worse than it's ever been. The Taliban themselves, one other element to watch is that the Taliban have different factions. And so there's more militant, there's more religiously conservative, there's more pragmatic, and people are watching closely to see. Right now, they're basically fighting with each other for who has the most power within the government. But that's all within the Taliban movement. They're not allowing any rivals, non-Pashtuns in. Ghani fled the country, a lot of the political leaders fled the country, but for example, Hamid Karzai, the previous president for 2 terms, and Abdullah, who had been the chief executive of the government, they stayed in Kabul. They're basically under house arrest, and the Taliban have no indication that they would give any kind of role, even ceremonial, to either one of them. So right now, they're trying to consolidate their power and dominate the government at all levels. It's an open question about whether people will resist that or not, but they have indicated diversity, in their opinion, is the different Taliban factions. It's not other ethnic groups.
Thank you. This question is for Chris. You showed photos of the children, the dentist, the doctor, the teachers, and others. I'm absolutely amazed about the buildings. Who designs the buildings and oversees their construction?
We have an Afghan manager who does that. He's an engineer. And he works with the village elders and the teachers of designing what's the best thing for them with the best use of our money. So there's no rooms for music or art or things like that, but they design them and then they maintain them. They make our money go incredibly far that we raise to support themselves. I think they're passing out.
There's apparently some talk of the Afghan reserves going to the families that survived the survivors of the 9/11 attack and not to Afghanistan. Given that Afghanistan is not a place that we're prepared to send that money, What do you think should happen to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a complicated issue. So, I mean, two things are happening. So, the 9/11 suits by 9/11 victims were against the Taliban, and they won a default judgment, so they have this multi-billion-dollar judgment against the Taliban. The issue is that the reserves, the state bank reserves, are property of the state, and obviously built up by the previous government. So the position of the U.S. and the world is the Taliban are not the proper government of Afghanistan, and therefore the reserves are not the money of the Taliban. So even though the judgment is against the Taliban, right now, I mean, it's the court's decision, but I don't think that the money could go to the 9/11 victims, because it's not the Taliban's money, it's the state's money. It's an interesting question. If and when the Taliban get recognized, then they could claim it. My understanding is that there are $7 billion that are in U.S. banks. And the recent announcement President Biden made was they took $3.5 billion, half of it, and put it in a special account that does not, it can't be accessed by the courts. So they've theoretically freed that money up to be spent on the Afghan economy, which is good. The other $3.5 billion is still subject to a court order, and we're in this limbo about is it the Taliban's money or not. I think that, one, the money should be for the benefit of Afghans. It was built up not by the Taliban, but by the elected government, and it should be used for the Afghan people. So I would oppose, declaring that it is Taliban money and it can be seized. The trick, though, is how do you spend that money in a way that's responsible? And this is where, again, my disclaimer of not being an economist comes in. Federal reserve funds of this state bank are used more for propping up the currency and imports and exports, not for buying meat or direct services. And so it seems like you should keep it aside, not for 9/11 victims, but you should somehow administer it in a way that it can have a long-term benefit for the Afghan people. And I think that's what they're trying to do, but that would be my best guess too.
We were in Afghanistan for 20 years, largely because we feared that Afghanistan would be a haven for Al-Qaeda and other terrorists. Two-part question. Since we have left in the last year, is there any evidence that Afghanistan has allowed terrorists into their country? And secondly, is there a possibility that we can couple our humanitarian aid and perhaps even ultimately recognition, couple it with their continuing to prevent terrorists to use their country?
Yeah, great question. I've asked my colleagues in the U.S. government the same question about Al-Qaeda, and they say it's classified. I don't think there's direct evidence that Al-Qaeda has come back in any significant numbers. And I think, honestly, Al-Qaeda has been seriously degraded through all of our counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan to Pakistan. So I don't think that Al-Qaeda right now is the most potent threat. I think ISIS is more of a threat, and they're more present in Afghanistan. So right now, ISIS has active resistance to the Taliban, and they're fighting each other. So I look in that direction. The intelligence estimates that are disclosed to Congress are that Al-Qaeda, under the current conditions, could regain a more significant foothold in 12 to 18 months. I can't independently evaluate that. So I think that there is a significant risk. Your question about conditioning, humanitarian assistance should not be conditioned. I mean, that's for livelihoods of ordinary Afghans for their survival. But the other assistance, yes, I think so. Certainly recognition should be conditioned on that. The agreement that I mentioned, the Doha Agreement, it's interesting that both the Taliban and the U.S. Still won't recognize it and want to enforce it, even though so many conditions in that about negotiating with the Afghan government were not observed. Fundamentally, the bargain of U.S. troops going for the Taliban prohibiting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or other groups from having a safe haven, both sides want to adhere to that. So I don't know how much of an incentive it will be, but right now that, the Taliban don't want us coming back in, even though I think politically we wouldn't anyway. And so they're trying to at least show that they're adhering to the counterterrorism provisions. But we have to ask our spies whether they're really doing it.
I have a microphone, so I'll go ahead and I want to congratulate you, Chris, on the schools and to comment on the construction. Of course, it seems that the last 20 years were relatively not fruitless. I don't know what to say, but the four of us all spent a lot of years in Afghanistan, and I worked to save the children. And so the country is built up with schools and clinics and medium hospitals, whatever. So there's infrastructure that's there. Of course, what will be lost is the personnel, right? So, but there's a lot of good that did happen for children, especially in those 20 years. And I just want to thank you for staying the course and doing what you've done in this one particular village. And then, Scott, a completely polar opposite kind of question is, what do you know about or see as the role of China in the future? Because certainly they have economic interests, but I just wondered politically, what your sense of things?
Okay. Yeah, good question. So, in some ways, Chinese influence on Afghanistan in relative terms, I think, has increased the most as a result of the Taliban takeover, but also, I think, distraction from Ukraine. But, is that really a benefit to them? I mean, it's more of a liability, I think, on a geopolitical balance sheet than it is a benefit. Look, China, they have very little risk from Afghanistan. They share a tiny border in the most mountainous region of the world. The Chinese genocide against the Uyghurs is an anti-Muslim extremist movement, so they fear the Taliban and Muslim extremists, but, practically speaking, there's no terrorism threat that really comes from Afghanistan and China. They have very little trade with Afghanistan. So I think they can basically afford to wait. The main interest of China is that they do have strong ties with Pakistan. Pakistan is very fragile. China, through their infrastructure development program called the Belt and Road, invested $65 billion in Pakistani infrastructure that are loans. So if Pakistan's economy collapses, they'll default. So it's more about protecting Pakistan from being destabilized by chaos in Afghanistan. And that's pretty indirect for China. The other thing I would say that a lot of people talk about, okay, well, Afghanistan has tons of valuable minerals, and whether it's rare earths or copper, so China's going to take advantage and raid all that. I wouldn't be too worried about it, because the Chinese won a huge contract to run a copper mine in 2007. They haven't even broken ground on it. There's no power, there's no railroad, so this idea that they would somehow exploit the resources to their advantage is like a 20-year in the future problem. So ultimately, I guess China just needs to make sure Pakistan doesn't collapse and then buy their time.
Chris, I just also wanted to compliment you for this work, for this dedication, and I wondered how you went about raising this money for all these years. Is this generous people from Michigan, or is this a way that you've created a whole link of people across the world?
Lots of schools. For the most part, it's been school fundraisers. So lots of schools over time have done lots of bake sales and chocolate-covered pretzel sales and book sales. It has mostly been school children, mostly elementary school children, that have run fundraisers multiple times during the year. We have had a couple of grants, but we have had no government help or anything like that. It's all done through a few churches who collect donations. The Unitarian Church has been a huge supporter of us, and different things like that. It cost us $5 a month per student to run the project.
Two separate questions for Chris. Is anything being done to allow this project to take over its own support? That's the first question.
Yes, okay.
And the second question is, what do you do about tracking your graduates to see how well their education is being used?
Two great questions. We have tried very hard to get industry, something industrious in the village that they can get on their own feet. Saffron is native of that area, so we've been trying to get some saffron in that area unsuccessfully with all of the issues of getting it across borders and getting it in there. We had a couple men that were trained in using scrap metal to create windmills, to build windmills for water, because right now we're using a diesel truck engine to pull up the water, and most of the mountains have valleys and the valleys have wind, so windmills would be very helpful. We have not been successful in getting an industry in there, and some of that is my fault because I just haven't been able to get engineers there that have a profession that can kind of spread that news and teach them. There's not very many people that want to go to this part of Afghanistan. You have to go through one of the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan to get to our project, which protects us, but is also a hardship for getting people in there to start a business model for the village. So we are working really hard on that. A lot of our parents, our dads mostly, will go to Iran or go to another big city and work and then bring back money to the village because we don't have something in the village. But that's a goal of ours. And then your second question, I've already forgotten. How about that? Oh, graduation. We track them. The teachers at the school try to keep track of where the kids go. There's not a lot of options in Afghanistan, so we know when they've left the village and they've gone to university. We did rent a home, actually we bought the home eventually, in Kabul, and we were renovating it to be a dormitory before the Taliban, the second Taliban took over, because we got permission from families to send students to Kabul in a dorm, and we had people that were going to manage that for us. But we haven't been able to start that yet because of the second Taliban. So that's, they do a nice job of tracking things, the teachers themselves in the village.
Any other questions for any of our guests, either of our guests? Okay.